Do you believe a single trip down to the river, on an evening that seemed so still, could change a man's entire life? There are frontier evenings that carry a strange kind of silence, not peace, but a hush that makes the heart beat harder, as if warning that something is about to happen. And it was on such an evening that Jonah McGraw, a former cavalryman who had already walked through war and stood at the graves of his wife and child, saw something he never expected. Before I tell you the whole story, don't forget to hit that like button to keep these Western tales alive. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from a breezy porch out in the country, or a small room tucked away in the city. I promise you this, if you ride with me to the very end, you'll see why a shadow on the riverbank could open a door to a fate Jonah never imagined. The sun had long slipped behind the ridge, leaving a flat ashen light spread across the valley. Cottonwoods swayed above the trail, their dead leaves rattling in the wind. Jonah McGraw walked slow along the gravel path, boots crunching, rifle slung across his back, 2 empty pails swinging at his side. He was on his way to fetch water, nothing unusual, just the same chore he'd done every evening for the past 5 years. Ever since fever stole his wife and young boy one winter. The cabin he built with his own hands wasn't a home, not anymore just shelter. A lonely box of logs where he patched fences, raised a few cows, and mended boots until the days blurred into one another. He barely spoke to anyone. Now and then he rode the half-day into town for flour, coffee, tobacco, and salt. Folks tipped their hats, offered a polite nod, and left him be. That was fine with Jonah. He didn't look for joy, didn't seek company. His mission, if he had one, was to survive in silence. But that night, the silence didn't feel right. From the first step down toward the river, the air pressed heavier. The wind carried a note he couldn't name. The water's murmur wasn't what caught him. It was the gap in sound, an emptiness that drew his eyes downriver. He set the pails aside, hand closing around the stock of his rifle. Old instincts from the war came alive again, how shadows hid snipers, how a smear of color meant ambush. He crept forward, heart pounding steady, and then he saw it clear. It wasn't a trap. It wasn't a dead animal caught in driftwood. It was a body, a girl. She lay crumpled on the wet stones, dark hair plastered to her face, skin pale as bone. A deerskin dress clung to her frame, torn and muddied, blood crusted along the fringe, one leg bent at a cruel angle beneath her. The river licked cold against her arm. Jonah froze. In that breath of time, he could have walked away. Should have. Maybe. Everyone in this territory knew bringing an injured Apache girl into your cabin was asking for trouble. Most men wouldn't lift a finger, wouldn't even bury her. But Jonah McGraw wasn't most men. He'd buried enough in his lifetime wife, son, comrades, enemies alike. The thought of adding one more nameless grave turned his stomach. "Damn it," he muttered, voice rough as gravel. He set the rifle down and bent low, sliding an arm beneath her shoulders, another under her knees. He lifted carefully. Her skin was ice cold, her breath faint, her bones too light as if hunger had already taken half her strength. When he shifted her leg, a broken groan escaped her lips. She was alive. That truth hit Jonah hard, left no room for retreat. He gathered her against his chest and started the climb back up the slope. Every step was heavy, his breath tearing in the cold. Sweat trickled down beneath the old cavalry coat. The path he'd walked 1,000 times felt twice as long, each rise steeper than the last. The cabin's outline finally came into view, square and dark against the fading sky. And Jonah knew from the moment he lifted her out of that river, his life of silence was over. Maybe he had just saved a fragile hope. Maybe he had invited danger right into his home. Either way, the cabin would never be the same. Maybe you've heard the saying, a man only truly remembers he's alive when he chooses to save someone else's life. Jonah McGraw never thought those words fit him, until that night. He carried the frail Apache girl into his cabin as if he were carrying a secret, both dangerous and fragile, a burden that could cost them both their lives if he stumbled. Before we dive deeper into this part of the tale, let me remind you once more, hit that like button so these frontier stories can keep living on. And don't hesitate to leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. Because sometimes, your presence, yes, even just a few words, is like a lantern shining in the night. A reminder that no one is ever truly alone. The cabin door creaked open under his shoulder. The night wind rushed in, cold and sharp, fanning the weak embers in the stove. Jonah pushed inside, bent low, and laid the girl gently on the only bed, a rough-hewn frame he hadn't shared with another soul in 5 long years. Her breath was threadbare, her skin pale and cold. Jonah grabbed an old wool blanket and pulled it over her, then crouched by the stove. He fed the fire until flames leapt high, throwing warm light across the log walls. Only then did he set his rifle aside and open the pine box where he kept scraps of army medicine rolls of bandage, a nearly spent vial of carbolic, a needle, a bit of thread. He worked slowly, carefully. He cleaned the dried blood along her ribs, uncovering a deep cut. Each touch made her flinch, her lips pushing out faint sounds of pain. Jonah gritted his teeth, forcing his hands steady. He had patched wounds on horses and soldiers, but never on a girl like this. Still, he knew if he didn't, she would die, and he couldn't bear to dig another grave behind this cabin. He cut 2 slats of wood for a splint, bound her twisted ankle tight. She let out a weak groan, fingers clutching the blanket, but she didn't cry out. Her eyes fluttered open once, dark and watchful even through the haze of pain. Jonah paused, poured warm water into a tin cup, and set it in her hands. He didn't force it, just said softly, "Drink." She looked at the cup, then at him. A whisper slipped from her cracked lips. Why such a small question? But it hit Jonah like a bullet. For a moment he couldn't answer. The fire popped behind him, dragging up memories of his wife's fever, his son's tiny grave. "Finally," he said, voice low and rough, "because I won't leave another soul behind." She didn't reply. She just nodded faintly, lifted the cup, and drank. That night, Jonah sat in the chair by the stove, cavalry coat still on his shoulders, eyes never leaving her slight form on the bed. The cabin was the same one-room shack it had always been, but it didn't feel like the same place anymore. There was another rhythm inside, now a fragile breathing that eased the heavy silence he'd carried for years. More than once, his head dropped, sleep pulling at him, only for him to wake at the sound of her labored breath. Each time, he checked the bandages, pulled the blanket higher, set his calloused hand gently near her wound to make sure the bleeding had slowed. His rough, work-worn fingers had built fences, handled rifles, swung axes, but now they moved with a clumsy tenderness, the kind born not of skill, but of care. When dawn crept in through the crooked window, the girl stirred, her eyes open dark, steady. For a long moment, neither spoke. They simply looked at one another. And in that silence there was no suspicion, no distance, only a fragile strand of trust, thin as thread, but present all the same. Jonah stood, threw another log on the fire, and turned his back to hide what stirred inside him. He didn't know her name, didn't know what danger she carried, but he knew one thing clearly: he had already chosen to keep her in the land of the living. Do you know how sometimes a story, once spoken aloud, doesn't just reveal the truth? It uncovers wounds buried deep inside the one telling it that morning, with firelight flickering across the rough log walls. Jonah McGraw listened to such a story, the story of Tayanita, the Apache girl he had pulled from the river's grip. Jonah sat across from her at the small table by the stove. He poured more coffee into a tin cup and slid it toward her. She took it with a trembling hand, thin fingers clinging to the warm metal. He didn't press her. Years alone had taught him patience, patience for wounds to close, patience for storms to pass. Now he waited for the girl before him to gather the strength to speak. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of firewood. Then her voice came, soft but steady. I was sent with a message. To a station north, near the ridge. Jonah lowered his cup, his eyes fixed on her, saying nothing. My father told me go quick, go quiet, let no one see. But they were waiting. 3 men, hired guns, I don't know their names, only their horses' ropes tied white, the mark of traitors' men. Her words came in fragments, each one heavy with memory. She paused, sipped the coffee, then went on. They knew I carried letters. They wanted me alive. I ran. I thought I was free. But my foot struck stone, and the river took me. If not for you. Her voice faded, but her eyes spoke more than her lips could carry. Jonah nodded slowly, his chest tightening. He had seen that look before in the eyes of young soldiers forced into battle. The look of someone not ready to die, but shoved to the edge all the same. So they're still near, he said at last, his voice rough. If I see smoke from a camp, it means they haven't gone far. Tayanita studied him. You're not afraid they'll come back. They'll kill anyone who shelters me. Jonah let out a long, heavy breath. His weathered hands laced together on the table. I've already lost enough. Tayanita, a few hired guns don't shake me anymore. What frightens me isn't danger. It's watching someone left to die when I could have stood in the way. For the first time, her face eased, not because the danger had vanished, but because someone else now carried a piece of the burden with her. That afternoon, Jonah carried her outside to the porch, settling her against a post so she could breathe the open air. The sky hung gray, clouds pulled tight over the peaks. From somewhere far off came the lonely call of a crow. Jonah wrapped another blanket around her shoulders before returning inside to straighten the cabin. Each time he glanced out, he saw her eyes scanning the valley. They no longer looked lost entirely. There was caution, yes, but also a quiet steadiness, as though she trusted that someone was watching her back. You were a soldier, she said when he returned with a stack of cedar. I see it in the scar on your arm. Jonah looked down at the faded gash along his forearm. He gave a slow nod. Yeah, I knew what ambush looks like. I knew loss. Maybe that's why I understand you more than I expected. She didn't answer with words. Instead, a fleeting smile touched her lips, fragile as firelight. Gone as quick. Yet to Jonah, it was enough to thaw something in him that had been frozen for years. As the day slipped toward dusk, Jonah walked the ridgeline. His eyes caught thin smoke rising from the west. Not hunting smoke, it burned too clean, too deliberate. He returned to the cabin and said quietly, You were right. They're still near. Tayanita tightened the blanket around her, but her gaze held steady. Then you know. Keeping me here puts you in their sights. Jonah was silent for a long moment before answering, his tone even but firm. There are dangers a man avoids, and there are dangers he accepts just to make sure someone else keeps breathing. Her eyes glimmered in the dim light, steady and searching. And in that moment, inside that little frontier cabin, a bond formed, no vows, no ceremony, just 2 souls marked by loss, finding in each other a piece of understanding neither had expected. Sometimes a man's decision isn't weighed by safety or risk, but by the weight of his conscience. And that night, after hearing all of Tayanita's story, Jonah McGraw knew he had stepped onto a path he couldn't turn back from. He was no longer just a stranger who had pulled a girl from the river. He had become the only shield standing between her and the men hiding in the hills. The fire in the stove burned bright, casting gold light across the rough log walls. Jonah sat for a long moment, staring into the coals as if answers might rise from the embers. Across the room, Tayanita leaned back against a blanket, her dark eyes open, watching quietly. Neither needed to speak. They both knew the danger was only a few miles off. Those hired guns wouldn't quit, not as long as they knew she was alive. Jonah rose and walked to the door. He set the bar across it, then opened an oilcloth bundle from his chest, revealing a revolver that still gleamed despite the years. His hands moved slow, steady, loading each chamber, checking the cylinder. Tayanita's voice broke the silence, gentle but firm. "You could let me go. Give me a horse. I'll ride alone. They won't trouble you anymore." Jonah paused, turned his head, and met her gaze. His eyes were hard, unwavering. "I saw you lying on those rocks, half dead in the cold. Don't ask me to turn my back now. I won't hand a living soul over to wolves." He set the revolver aside and reached for his old rifle. His grip trembled, but not from fear memory had that effect. He had walked too far from gunfire, tried to bury the sound of it under years of silence. Yet now he understood avoiding violence forever was just another way of letting evil win. He wasn't choosing bloodshed. He was choosing to protect. Tayanita lowered her eyes, speaking slowly. "My people always said, not many have the courage to stand beside someone marked as an outcast. You owe me nothing." Jonah. His sigh was deep, heavy. He leaned both hands on the table. "Maybe I owe you nothing, but there are things a man can't walk away from. If I did, I couldn't look at myself again. Better to stand and face it." Something flickered in her eyes then, a look he hadn't expected, like a quiet gratitude that someone, at last, saw her life as worth defending. Through the evening, Jonah worked the cabin like a soldier setting defenses. He reinforced the door with an extra beam, pushed a chair under the window frame, placed weapons within reach. Each movement carried the same silent vow he would not abandon her, no matter the cost. Tayanita watched, her eyes following him with a strange mix of worry and wonder. For the first time, someone's determination to fight wasn't about conquest or pride. It was about her survival. When his work was done, Jonah sat by the fire again. He uncorked a jug, took a long drink, then passed it across the table. She accepted, sipped, then asked softly, "Aren't you afraid to die?" He didn't answer right away. He stared into the flames, voice low when it finally came. "I died once already when I buried my wife and boy under winter snow. What's left is just a man walking. If death comes now, and it means saving a life, then at least I'll know it meant something." The room fell quiet again, only the whistle of wind outside filling the space. That night, Jonah didn't sleep. He sat against the wall, rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the shuttered window. His shadow stretched across the planks, tall and firm, as steady as the choice he'd made. The old pain still lived in him, the scars of loss still deep. But for the first time in years, he felt a reason to rise above his solitude. That reason had a name, Tayanita, a girl fragile in body but unbroken in spirit, who had somehow lit back the part of him that once knew how to protect. When the pale moon spread over the clearing, Jonah whispered into the stillness, not sure if he was speaking to her or to himself. "From this moment, you're not alone. As long as I draw breath, no one lays a hand on you." And in the dark, though the danger still lingered, the little cabin burned with more than firewood. It burned with resolve, with the quiet promise of a man who had chosen to stand and shield. When a man has chosen to stand in defense, he knows the day will come when he must face what's coming. For Jonah McGraw, That day arrived sooner than expected. Evening dropped fast, the light pulling out of the valley until the ridges lay swallowed in shadow. His cabin stood silent under the cottonwoods, but the silence was the kind that carried warning. Tayanita sat close to the fire, wrapped tight in a blanket. Every sound outside made her lift her head. Jonah felt it too, not just heard, but sensed the weight in the air. Years as a cavalry scout had taught him that silence often shouted louder than gunfire. He rose, rifle in hand, eyes on the door. Then it came the steady beat of hooves. 1 horse, then 3. Not rushing, not careless, but slow and measured, a sound meant to be heard by the man inside. Jonah slid the bar across the door and stepped out onto the porch. The night wind cut across his face, carrying the scent of horse and gun oil. Under the thin slice of moon, 3 riders took shape, saddles heavy, holsters glinting. At their head rode Silas Grady, tall and lean, his shoulders draped in a dust-stained coat. Grady carried himself with the arrogance of a man certain he already owned the outcome. He reined in and let a crooked smile show. His voice rasped out into the night. "McGraw, is it word is, you've got something that doesn't belong to you?" Jonah stood square, rifle in his hand but barrel down. "If you're speaking of the girl inside, let me set you straight. She belongs to no one but herself. And tonight, she's not going anywhere." The 2 men flanking Grady snickered, hands resting on their pistols. Behind Jonah, the cabin door creaked. Tayanita stepped into the frame, bracing herself on the post. Grady's eyes caught her, and the smile on his face twisted into a sneer. "Girl, you think that old soldier can keep you safe? He's nothing but a relic. And we're paid to see this through. Paid well enough that nothing stops us." Jonah's voice cut in, low and iron hard. "I've buried more men than you've got bullets. Don't test me." The air locked tight. One of the hired guns slid a Colt halfway from its holster, moonlight flashing along the steel. Jonah shifted just enough to mark the movement. 3 armed men, a narrow porch, a single breath from turning the night into blood. But before it broke, Tayanita's voice rang out, sharp and clear. "I'm not going anywhere. If you came for secrets, you came for the wrong one." Her words sliced through the standoff, and Grady's smile vanished. He turned his gaze back to Jonah. "You really willing to die for some tribal girl?" Jonah lifted the rifle. Not aimed yet, but firm in his grip. "I'm not dying for anyone, but I'll kill any man who drags the innocent to their death. If you want to find out, start here." The world seemed to hold its breath. Wind pressed against the walls of the cabin, boards creaking as though the house itself waited. Then Grady barked a dry laugh. He raised a hand, halting his man before steel left leather. "Not tonight. But mark my words. McGraw will be back, and next time, we won't be talking first." He jerked his reins, and the 3 horses wheeled back into the dark. Their hoofbeats faded down the ridge, swallowed by the trees. Jonah kept the rifle raised until nothing moved but the wind. When he turned, Tayanita still stood at the doorway, hand trembling on the frame, her eyes burning bright. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. Jonah stepped onto the porch, his face set. "Maybe not, but I'd do it again." "You're not something they get to buy and sell." In that moment, with the night air sharp and the smell of gun oil still hanging, it was clear Jonah's cabin was no longer just a place of solitude. It had become a line in the sand. And the man who had once lived only with grief now had a reason to shoulder his rifle again, not for himself, but for the dignity and the life of the girl he had vowed to protect. That morning broke quiet, but it was not the quiet of peace. After the tense standoff with Silas Grady and his men, Jonah McGraw still sat near the window, rifle across his lap, ears tuned to every sound in the timber. Tayanita dozed in fits, but her hands clutched the blanket tight, unwilling to let go. This silence wasn't relief. It was the pause between storms, fragile and waiting. When the sun finally crested the ridge, pale light spilling across the valley. Jonah stepped onto the porch and drew a deep breath. He had lived alone so long he had grown used to watching over no one but himself. Now, it was different. There was someone inside who needed him, trusted him, and he knew he could not walk away. His eyes caught a thin column of smoke on the eastern rim, not the careless smoke of hired guns, but a clean, deliberate sign. His chest tightened with a strange certainty. By midday, that certainty took form. Out of the trees rode a single horseman. A tall black stallion carried a broad-shouldered man with long braided hair, streaked with silver, a coat trimmed with beads and worn feathers. His face was carved with time and authority, eyes dark and steady. With every step closer, the air itself seemed to grow heavier. Jonah didn't need a name to know. This was Naiche, Tayanita's father. Jonah stood firm, hand resting on the rifle stock but not raising it. Behind him, the cabin door opened, and Tayanita leaned against the frame, breath quick, eyes wide. "Father," she whispered, voice trembling but warm. Naiche dismounted, boots crunching slow across the dirt. His gaze swept from the bandaged leg of his daughter to the weathered, solid frame of Jonah. No words yet. The silence held until Naiche spoke, voice deep as stone rolling down a canyon. "You found my daughter." Jonah gave a single nod. "I pulled her from the river, kept her breathing since that day." Naiche's eyes narrowed, weighing the truth of it. "You fed her. You guarded her. You invited trouble that was not yours." Jonah's answer came steady. "I just didn't want to dig another grave, and she deserves to live." For a long moment, Naiche said nothing. Then he turned to his daughter. He laid a calloused hand on her shoulder more than a touch. It was a recognition. From the saddlebag he drew a small bundle and unwrapped it, a beaded pouch, a woven blanket, and a carved piece of wood etched with tribal marks. He placed them into her hands. His words carried the weight of judgment and blessing both. "You are free. You are not forgotten. The choice is yours." Her eyes shone, tears threatening but held back. She clutched the bundle to her chest. "Father," was all she could manage. Naiche nodded once, then turned back toward Jonah. He stepped closer, his dark eyes locking with the tired but unflinching gaze of the white man who stood his ground. "If she chooses to stay, your name is hers now, not only for protection, for meaning. My daughter will carry it, if that is her will." Jonah swallowed hard. He had not asked for this moment, but he would not shy from it. He gave a slow nod. "I understand." Without another word, Naiche mounted his horse. He left no warning, no blessing, only a silence heavy as judgment, but weighted also with trust. When his figure faded into the timber, Tayanita turned, her eyes glistening though no tears fell. "He gave me the choice," she said softly. Jonah looked at her, voice rough yet gentle. "And what do you choose?" "Tayanita." The valley seemed to still, wind pausing in the cottonwoods. The Apache girl, who had been given back her freedom and her memory, met the eyes of the man who had lived in grief for so long. A small, proud smile touched her lips. "I choose to stay." Jonah said nothing at first, only nodded, but inside him rose a gratitude deeper than words. Gratitude that Naiche had not seen him as an enemy, but as a man who had done the right thing. Gratitude for the trust, for the chance to begin again out of ruin. The old cabin seemed brighter, warmer, no longer just the refuge of a widower, but the place where a choice had been spoken about life, about loyalty, and about the right to one's own freedom. There are days, after storms have passed, when a man begins to feel the weight of silence differently. For Jonah McGraw, that silence no longer pressed down like emptiness. Instead, it carried the warmth of something new beginning. After Naiche had ridden away, leaving behind both recognition and the gift of choice for his daughter, the old cabin on the hillside seemed to change. It was no longer just a stronghold against darkness. It had quietly become a home for two souls who never expected to find each other. The days slipped by in small, steady rhythms. Jonah still rose early, built the fire, and poured black coffee into a tin cup. The only difference was that now he poured a second, setting it across the table for Tayanita. She would emerge from the bed, wrapped in a blanket, her long hair falling loose, her face still pale from healing wounds, but her eyes brighter each morning. She took the cup in both hands, gave him a small nod instead of words, and that simple gesture filled the room with warmth. Jonah worked the fences. Tayanita sat on the porch weaving strips of bark into cord. He herded cattle toward the creek, and she followed behind on the rough pine crutches he had shaped for her, steadying herself step by step. Sometimes she stumbled and laughed at her own clumsiness. Jonah, who had not heard laughter inside his home for 5 long years, lifted his head in surprise, struck by the sound as though it were spring water rushing through frozen stone. In the afternoons, they sat by the fire together. He carved wood into small shapes, a bird, a fish, a plaque etched with the word home. She sewed old blankets with careful stitches. When the blade slipped and nicked his hand, she leaned close, wrapping the cut gently in cloth. Their eyes met at close distance, and though no words passed, the silence between them carried more weight than speech. Each night, when wind moaned across the cabin walls, Jonah no longer heard only loss. Once, it had reminded him of the cries he buried under snow. Now, it mingled with the crackle of firewood and the steady rhythm of Tayanita's breath. She slept without clutching a knife, her shoulders finally at rest. And Jonah, for the first time in years, closed his eyes without dreams of graves. One morning, when the snow gave way to patches of grass, Tayanita stood by the fence without her crutches. Jonah came from the barn, a bucket of water in his hand, and stopped when he saw her smile. His heart beat differently, then not from fear, but from the realization that the cabin was no longer his alone. It had become their place, where the past loosened its grip and made room for hope. On rare trips into town, Jonah was no longer a solitary figure. Tayanita rode beside him in the wagon, calm under the stares of townsfolk. Curious eyes followed them, some harsh, some cautious. Jonah said nothing. He only rested his rough hand over hers on the bench. The gesture spoke louder than any defense enough to silence whispers without a single word. One night, with the valley blanketed in silver light, they sat on the porch steps watching fog settle in the hollow below. Jonah's voice was slow, rough but certain. For years I thought I'd die with no one left to speak my name. But now I've got a reason to wake up every morning. Tayanita turned, her eyes catching the moonlight. She didn't answer. Instead, she let her shoulder rest lightly against his. And in that moment, Jonah understood love did not crash down like a storm. It came like thawing ice, steady, unstoppable, reshaping the land around it, in that quiet, in the gentle closeness that needed no explanation. Jonah knew he had stepped out of the shadow of grief and into a beginning that no longer walked alone. There are springs that bring more than the return of grass and leaves, they bring the rebirth of a man's heart. For Jonah McGraw, that spring was the first in years when the sunrise meant more than just another day survived. It meant the beginning of a new life. The hard winter had broken. The snow pulled back to reveal dark, waiting soil, and inside the cabin that had once stood as a monument to grief. There now came the sound of 2 lives' footsteps side by side. Quiet laughter, the simple music of a home being born. Jonah had always been the man folks called solitary. He was used to silence at his table, used to cold creeping through the logs at night, used to hearing only his own voice when he muttered to break the emptiness. But now, there was another voice, Tayanita's, her questions, her soft laughter. Even the steady rhythm of her sewing needle made the cabin feel alive. Small things, but to Jonah, they were nothing short of miracles. One morning he saddled up and rode into town. He said nothing of his errand. People at the courthouse knew Jonah McGraw as a man who came for salt, flour, or tobacco, not for anything more. But that day, he stood at the counter, his back straight, his voice deep and firm. I want to change the deed. Not just my name. Write it under both Jonah McGraw and Tayanita. The clerk, old and stiff-shouldered, blinked in surprise, then stamped the paper with a heavy thud. The sound of the gavel sealing the record was the sound of a new chapter. When Jonah returned, he carried a roll of paper tied with leather. Tayanita sat on the porch, spring sunlight across her hair. She watched him set the roll before her. She unwrapped it, her eyes scanning the lines until they caught on her name written beside his. Her hands trembled as she traced the letters, then lifted her gaze to his. Jonah didn't waste words. This is our home. If tomorrow I'm gone, you'll still have a place that's yours. And if you choose to stay, this land will hold not just us, but everything we've built together. Her eyes shimmered. For the first time, she reached for his hand and held it tight. In that moment, the cabin ceased to be shelter alone. It became theirs. The days filled with preparation for planting. Jonah repaired the roof of the barn, drove posts into the thawed ground. Tayanita knelt by a small patch of earth, pressing seeds gently into the soil, covering them with careful hands as though she was guarding new life. Sometimes she lifted her head and caught Jonah's eyes, and they shared a quiet smile. They both knew they were planting more than crops. They were planting a future. The townsfolk soon noticed the change. Jonah no longer rode in alone. When the wagon rolled through, Tayanita sat at his side. Curious eyes followed them, some wary, some cold, but Jonah never faltered. He laid his rough hand over hers on the bench, a simple gesture that spoke louder than a dozen words. People saw it, and most lowered their eyes, understanding what it meant. At night, the cabin glowed with lamplight, a beacon in the dark valley. Inside, their suppers were plain cornbread, smoked meat, beans, but the way Jonah slid the best piece onto her plate, or the way she folded a cloth and set it near his hand, carried the weight of devotion. These were not grand declarations, but the steady stitching of love. One evening, staring into the fire, Jonah spoke slowly. I once thought I had nothing left to give this world, but it turns out I can still build a home, and maybe I can love again. Tayanita said nothing. She only laid her hand over his, soft but certain. It was answer enough. And now, dear friends listening to this story, you can feel what has taken root. Can't you? A man who once buried his heart in silence now dares to open it, to give, to build, to love. Isn't that something worth holding on to? If you believe Jonah deserves this second chance, let him know. Share your thoughts. Should he grow the ranch larger? Add a room for the family that may come, or should he simply keep tending the peace he's found? One day at a time, because here, on the rugged frontier, this tale does not end in loss. It ends in rebirth. Jonah and Tayanita have chosen each other not by force, not by duty, but by freedom. And in that choice lies the beginning of a home. A small home, yes, but strong as the land itself. A place where silence has given way to laughter, and where two hearts, once broken, have finally begun again.